For lab exercise number 8, there's a big change. We are moving into Logic, and this is not necessarily going to go right along with everything else, probably not at all. But we need to get this worked in somehow because here in just a few weeks, you're going to be doing some things that you're going to need a little bit of background in Logic in order to feel good about. So one of the first things that I want to talk about with Logic is, of course, you've got these faders, and most of you can probably guess you pull a fader down, you pull a fader up, and that lowers or raises whatever's on that track. So you want to make your guitar louder, boom, softer, like this. And it's really amazingly important for most projects for you to do your absolute best to get the project working just using the faders. Just trying to figure out where everything needs to balance at, because it's really easy to make mistakes in terms of trying to add extra processing to fix a problem, when sometimes it really is as simple as you don't need to turn the guitar up, you need to pull the bass down, or something like that. Some piece of the mix is masking some other piece of the mix, and it really can be as simple as getting your faders balanced. So I say all that because even though I'm getting ready to jump into EQ, I don't want EQ to be the first thing that you think of. I want you to think of balancing your faders as the very first thing, and that goes for big projects where there's drums and bass and keys and multiple vocalists, multiple guitars, all that type of stuff. You're way better off trying to keep as much tone intact from the original recording as possible, and the best way to do that is to balance with your faders first. Okay, so having said that, let's now talk about EQ. That's one of the primary tools that you're going to be able to employ with anything that you're going to be balancing or fitting into a mix, rather. Now, I have pulled up here a old project from spring of 2017. This is Zenon Garcia vocals. I'm going to solo his vocals here, and I'm going to go ahead also and turn off my other plugins. Let's get rid of the ones that aren't being used. We'll leave that one alone. This way we're going to hear exactly what we have vocal-wise without any treatment at all. I'm going to turn off that bus as well. Okay, this is bone dry, right on the stage of Lovett Auditorium with bleed coming through from the drums and everything. Here we go.
I was in the marketplace in the autumn of last year. That's when all the trees fell down to the bottom of the air.
Now, Zenon is singing into a really expensive large diaphragm tube condenser mic that is known for having a giant bass sound. It's got a lot of emphasis on the low mids and bass, and for some voices that's great, and some voices it's not so great. We also had that big bassy mic in a figure 8 pickup pattern, and the figure 8 pattern is probably one of the more sensitive to proximity effect. So when you get close to a figure 8 mic, and I'm guessing Zenon was probably 6 or 7 inches away from this mic. I'm not entirely sure where he was, but I'm thinking he was pretty close to it. We had a pop filter between him and the mic that kept him from getting any closer, but I'm guessing he was 6 inches away or so, and that's probably a little too close. So this vocal has a lot of low end that probably is not going to work in terms of a pop mix or a indie mix or an alternative mix or whatever you want to call it. There's probably going to just be too much low end. It's really common for people to use EQ to roll off the bass. People will call it a high pass filter because it's passing the highs but rolling off the bass. And with the Logic EQ, we come over here to any of these little slots. They're below the input, above the stereo out, above the buses. You click on any of these guys, and all options pop up for plugins. And you can experiment with absolutely any of these. Go crazy if you want to, but I'm talking today about EQ. We're going to go to the channel EQ right here. And the first thing I want to talk about is this bass roll-off curve. You'll see that there are different types of curves. This is a shelf. Here are some bell curves. Here's another shelf. And there's another roll-off on the high end. So I click this roll-off on the low end, and you'll see that it engages. If I turn it off, there's nothing there. If I turn it on, you've got a little bit. Then I can grab this and actually just drag it over this roll-off further and further into my main frequency range. And I can go crazy. I mean, I can go all the way up here with it.
I was in the marketplace in the autumn of last year. That's when all the trees fell down to the bottom of the air.
So I'm going to go ahead and bring it back here, and you'll notice if I roll up, it gets a sharper curve, and if I roll down, it mellows the curve out. You can kind of see that moving a little bit. So usually, with a vocal like this, you don't really want anything dramatic happening in the low end, much below maybe 80, 90, 100 hertz. But because we already had an exaggerated low end, we're probably going to end up cutting even more than that. So you see right here, we start rolling off gently after 500. And by the time we get to 200 hertz here, we're down at least 5 dB. There's the 0 to 5, so this line right here is a 5 dB line, and we're maybe 6 dB by the time we get to 200 hertz. So let's listen to this, and then we'll go back and take it off and see what the difference is.
I was in the marketplace. I was in the marketplace.
Now maybe that's too much, but it might actually fit just fine once we bring a bass guitar in, a 23-inch bass drum, and a couple of guitars. There might be so much going on with those four things that you don't really have room for his vocal to have a lot of stuff down low. But I do know that in this song, he does have some very sparse places where it's pretty much just him singing and nothing else. Maybe a very soft bass and everything's dropped out. So we have to be careful that we don't take so much out that it sounds unnatural when he's singing naked. We could, of course, automate this thing to where it brings the bass back in when he needs it and pulls it out when he doesn't. But this is just one of the really common first types of moves for EQ. And that goes for EQ anywhere, not just recording, but even live sound. Live soundboards have these bass roll-off options on every channel, specifically so that you can get a hold of, you can get control of all those raging low-end frequencies that you don't need on every single channel. I'll pull it back here a little bit and give him a little bit more low end.
I was in the marketplace. I was in the marketplace.
Now, if you don't have decent headphones or speakers, it might be hard to hear that, especially on like a laptop. So earbuds would probably help out a little bit if you can't hear that. But that's the type of thing that EQ is, it's just like EQ lesson 1. That's super common to try to control low end. I can boost things, but you'll find that quite often boosting is not the first thing that you reach for. It's not a bad idea if you've got plenty of time to kill, because you might end up just wasting all your time. But you can grab things and bring them up. If I change the width, how wide the band is, that is called the Q. I am making the Q higher. Like this might be a Q of, we can see down here at the bottom, the Q number is 2 right there. And as the Q gets lower, 1, and then it gets down to 0.98, 0.4, that's wider. So the lower the Q number, the wider the frequency band. The higher the Q, the more narrow the notch is until it becomes a real spiky thing like that. If I'm doing notches like this, these things can be handy to sweep around. We'll try it on Xenon here.
I was in the marketplace in the autumn of last year. That's when all the trees fell down.
So one thing that people used to do before they had tools that took care of S's, people say the consonant S, and sometimes it's too bright. It just jumps out compared to the rest of their vowel sounds. People would find where the S's are, and they'd sweep around until they made the S just painfully unbearable. Once they found where that was, you come and you'd pull it down. And that would help notch just the S sound out of the vocal without doing a whole lot else to the vocal. So that might be an application of using the Q in a very narrow notch type of way. But most of the time, you're going to get a more natural sound with keeping the Q low and doing these types of changes. A wide band that kind of just boosts a little bit. Outside of this bass roll-off, I tend to make changes in 3 decibel increments, like +3 or -3. That is that can be hard to hear, but it can also be really dramatic too. And so if you don't hear it when you make that change, sometimes you're at the wrong frequency. Maybe you were trying to make things brighter and you're at 2,000 hertz. Maybe you should have been at 3,700 hertz. And now if you do just a 3 dB change, you're going to hear it because you're at the right place now. So if you're at the wrong point, sometimes you end up boosting, and by the time you hear it, what you're really hearing is where you've boosted over here, but now you've added a whole bunch of junk you didn't need at the wrong frequency point. So EQ, it's kind of the biggest tool in your arsenal. Different types of EQs have different flavors as well. This Logic EQ is a very basic, what we call parametric EQ. Parametric means that we can go to any frequency point. We can change the width of the band. We can move it all over the place, and it's just fully functional so that pretty much anything you can imagine you can do. I have some other EQs that model different hardware EQs that were popular 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And some of those guys have certain characteristics that people love for certain applications. So EQs can be better or worse than other EQs. I remember a long time ago, Logic's EQ didn't sound as good as one of the EQs that I had purchased myself from a company called iZotope, and it's built into their mastering plugin, Ozone. It's really similar. If I go to Ozone, you see that again, I have these EQ bands where I can make the notches narrow or wide. I can drag them around. I can do all this stuff. But this particular EQ, if you look up here, you'll see that I can switch between an analog modeling or a digital modeling option. And I really thought that the analog just sounded more musical. It didn't sound as harsh to me, but that was a long time ago. I think Logic's EQs have gotten a lot better over the years, and I'm not so sure there's as big of a difference anymore. But do be aware that, just because you've grabbed an EQ doesn't mean it's going to sound as good as some other EQ. I also have a couple of hardware EQs that we'll talk about at some point that we use primarily for tracking drums with. And I have 2 different hardware versions. I have a radial EQ, which is about a $600 EQ, and then I've got some cheaper ones that are DBXs that are about $200. And you can hear that the $600 EQ just has a better sound. And so software EQs are similar. Mess around with that. Get you a microphone out and do a voiceover or sing a little bit or record an acoustic guitar, and then start tweaking it. and come up with two versions, the before and the after. And we'll double check that, and that'll be your lab exercise for this week. Good luck.